November 1942. Stalingrad, Mamayev-Kurgan sector. Senior Sergeant Yakov Pavlov stood in the rubble of a 4-story apartment building, now designated Dom Pavlov on Soviet tactical maps. He'd been awake for 68 hours. His hands trembled. His vision occasionally doubled. But he wasn't collapsing. His squad wasn't collapsing. They held their position through 3 consecutive German assaults because a Red Army medical officer had distributed small white tablets with instructions to take 1 every 8 hours. The tablets were Pervitin, pharmaceutical methamphetamine, and they were keeping the defenders of Stalingrad conscious, alert, and fighting long past the point where human biology should have forced surrender to exhaustion. The Soviets weren't the first to use stimulants in warfare, nor the last, but Stalingrad represented the most desperate large-scale application of combat pharmaceuticals in military history. The German Sixth Army had superior training, better equipment, and tactical advantages. What they didn't have was the pharmaceutical-enhanced endurance that allowed Soviet defenders to man defensive positions continuously for 3 to 4 days without sleep. The tablets didn't make soldiers invincible. They made them temporarily immune to the physical demands of rest, creating defenders who fought like machines until the drugs wore off and they collapsed wherever they stood. The practice began with pragmatic desperation. By October 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had devolved into close-quarters urban warfare measured in meters rather than kilometers. Buildings changed hands multiple times daily. A position held in the morning might be German by afternoon, and Soviet again by nightfall. The physical and psychological demands were catastrophic. Soldiers needed to maintain constant vigilance, respond instantly to threats from any direction, and function under sustained stress that should have been physiologically impossible. The Red Army Medical Service had access to Pervitin through captured German supplies and domestic production. The Germans had been issuing methamphetamine to their troops since 1938 under the brand name Pervitin, manufactured by the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company in Berlin. German soldiers called them Stuka tablets or Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate, because they were routinely distributed to Luftwaffe pilots and panzer crews during sustained operations. The Soviets had captured significant quantities during the defense of Moscow in 1941 and analyzed the composition. By mid-1942, Soviet pharmaceutical facilities were producing their own methamphetamine compounds. The drug itself was simple, effective, and devastatingly addictive. Methamphetamine is a central nervous system stimulant that works by flooding the brain with dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. The effects are immediate and dramatic. Within 15 minutes of ingestion, users experience heightened alertness, reduced appetite, decreased perception of fatigue, increased confidence, and a sense of euphoric energy. For a soldier in combat, these effects translated to extended operational capability far beyond normal human limits. The standard dose distributed at Stalingrad was 3 milligrams, taken every 8 to 12 hours. Soviet medical officers had observed German dosing protocols and adopted similar guidelines, though enforcement varied wildly depending on unit commanders and tactical situations. In desperate defensive positions like Pavlov's house or the grain elevator, soldiers were sometimes given discretionary access to tablets, resulting in consumption patterns that far exceeded recommended dosages. The physiological mechanism was straightforward. Methamphetamine prevents the reuptake of neurotransmitters, keeping them active in the synaptic gap between neurons. This sustained activation creates the perception of limitless energy and alertness. The body's normal fatigue signals the accumulation of adenosine, the decline in glucose metabolism, the physical demand for sleep, are simply overridden by the drug's neurochemical effects. The fatigue doesn't disappear. It accumulates silently while the user remains conscious and functional. For the defenders of Stalingrad, this pharmaceutical override meant unprecedented defensive capability. A squad of 12 men could maintain a fortified position for 72 hours without relief, rotating through brief rest periods, but remaining combat-ready throughout. A machine gun crew could stay at their weapon through sustained engagements that would normally require multiple crews. Anti-tank teams could maintain vigilance through long periods of German armor probing, then respond with full capability when targets appeared. The tactical advantages were obvious and immediately exploited. Soviet commanders identified critical defensive positions, factories, apartment complexes, railway stations, and assigned reinforced squads with explicit instructions to hold regardless of casualties or duration. These units received priority supply of Pervitin tablets, along with ammunition and food. The expectation was simple. You will not sleep. You will not rest. You will hold this position until ordered otherwise, or until you are dead. The drugs made that expectation achievable, if only temporarily. Pavlov's house became the most famous example. From September 27th to November 25th, 1942, a small group of Soviet soldiers held a 4-story apartment building against repeated German assault. The building had clear fields of fire, was well positioned for defense, and, critically, was defended by men who could maintain 24-hour vigilance through pharmaceutical enhancement. German intelligence reports from the period noted with frustration that Soviet defenders in certain fortified positions seemed to never sleep, never reduce alertness, never show the normal degradation of performance that comes with sustained combat. The German observers were partially correct, but missed the pharmaceutical explanation. They attributed the Soviet endurance to ideological fervor or desperation. In reality, it was methamphetamine combined with desperation. The ideology mattered. Soviet soldiers fighting for Stalingrad understood the stakes, but consciousness itself was maintained through chemical means. The human cost of this practice became apparent when the drugs wore off. A soldier who'd been awake for 60 or 70 hours would crash catastrophically. The accumulated sleep deprivation, combined with the neurotransmitter depletion caused by the methamphetamine, produced collapse that looked like death. Medical officers reported soldiers falling asleep mid-sentence, collapsing while walking, or simply shutting down wherever they stood. Some slept for 24 hours straight. Others entered near comatose states lasting days. The cardiovascular effects were equally severe. Methamphetamine increases heart rate and blood pressure significantly. Soldiers already stressed by combat, cold, malnutrition, and dehydration experienced cardiac complications at alarming rates. Heart attacks among men in their 20s and 30s. Strokes, cardiac arrhythmias that proved fatal. The official cause of death would be listed as heart failure or combat stress, but the underlying cause was pharmaceutical. The psychological consequences emerged more slowly. Methamphetamine produces genuine paranoia and hallucinations with sustained use. Soviet soldiers in fortified positions sometimes reported German infiltrators who didn't exist, fired at phantoms, or became convinced their own comrades were enemy agents. Some units experienced what would now be recognized as amphetamine psychosis, a drug-induced state of paranoid delusion that could last days after the drug was discontinued. If you're finding this examination of desperate wartime measures and their consequences compelling, subscribing helps ensure you don't miss future investigations into how extreme circumstances shape human decisions and technologies. The Red Army Medical Service documented these problems, but had no alternative solutions. The tactical situation demanded extended wakefulness. Soldiers couldn't maintain that without pharmacological assistance. The choice was between accepting the side effects and casualties from drug use, or accepting the tactical consequences of normal human fatigue limitations. In the context of Stalingrad, where the entire Soviet war effort depended on holding the city, the choice was obvious. The Germans faced similar calculations with similar drugs. Wehrmacht units attacking Stalingrad were also using Pervitin, particularly among assault troops and tank crews. The difference was that German forces generally had better rotation and relief capabilities. A Wehrmacht unit could be pulled back, rested, and returned to combat. Soviet defenders often had no rear area to retreat to. They held their positions or died in them. The pharmaceutical enhancement wasn't optional. It was the only way to maintain defensive capability with the limited manpower available. The production and distribution logistics were surprisingly robust. Soviet pharmaceutical facilities in the Urals produced methamphetamine in tablet form throughout 1942 and 1943. Distribution followed the same supply chains as ammunition and food. Priority units, those holding critical positions, received regular pharmaceutical resupply along with their other materiel. A typical ration for a reinforced squad defending a fortified position included 3 days' food, ammunition for expected engagements, and 45 to 60 Pervitin tablets, calculated at 3 per man per day for a 5-man squad over 3 days. The tablets themselves were indistinguishable from standard medical supplies. Small, white, stamped with basic identification codes. They came in sealed metal tins of 50, similar to packaging for aspirin or other medications. A soldier carrying a tin of Pervitin looked no different from one carrying pain medication or anti-dysentery tablets. The similarity was partly intentional. Soviet commanders didn't want German forces to understand that pharmaceutical enhancement was widespread. German intelligence did eventually piece together the Soviet stimulant use, partly because they were doing the same thing. Both sides understood that the other was using similar drugs, creating a chemical arms race of endurance. The advantage went to whichever side could keep soldiers conscious and functional longer. In defensive urban warfare, where small units held critical positions for extended periods, the side whose soldiers could stay awake won the battle of attrition. The broader Wehrmacht had more systematic stimulant use. German military pharmacology had been developing combat drugs since the mid-1930s. Pervitin was mass-produced and distributed across all branches of service. The Luftwaffe issued it to bomber crews for long missions. The Kriegsmarine gave it to submarine crews. The Heer distributed it to infantry and armor units. German soldiers consumed an estimated 35 million Pervitin tablets in 1940 alone during the invasion of France. By Stalingrad, the practice was well established and fully integrated into German military logistics. The Soviets approached pharmaceutical enhancement more cautiously, at least initially. Soviet military doctrine emphasized discipline and endurance rather than pharmaceutical shortcuts. But the desperate circumstances of 1941 and 1942 forced pragmatic adaptation. If the Germans were using stimulants effectively, the Red Army needed to match or exceed that capability. Stalingrad became the testing ground for mass Soviet stimulant distribution under extreme combat conditions. The long-term effects on soldiers were predictable and grim. Methamphetamine is highly addictive, particularly when used under stressful conditions that reinforce its effects. A soldier who experienced the enhanced capability, the confidence, the elimination of fear and fatigue, wanted that state again. Many continued using stimulants after Stalingrad, either through official channels when available or through black market sources when not. Soviet medical records from 1943 and 1944 show increasing numbers of soldiers presenting with what we'd now recognize as stimulant addiction. Tremors, insomnia even when exhausted, paranoia, aggressive behavior, cardiovascular problems. The records use various euphemistic terms: battle fatigue, nervous exhaustion, cardiac stress, But the underlying cause was often chronic methamphetamine use initiated during desperate defensive operations. The addiction problem was compounded by the Soviet military's general approach to combat stress. Psychological casualties were viewed with suspicion, often treated as cowardice or malingering. A soldier presenting with amphetamine withdrawal symptoms, depression, exhaustion, inability to function, risked being accused of avoiding duty. The safer option was to continue using stimulants, hiding the dependency, and hoping for survival until war's end. The practice continued throughout the war, though less desperately than at Stalingrad. As the Red Army transitioned to offensive operations in 1943 and 1944, the need for sustained defensive pharmaceutical enhancement decreased, but stimulants remained available for assault units, reconnaissance troops, and tank crews. The drug that had been emergency equipment in November 1942 became standard issue for certain specialties by 1944. Other nations used stimulants too, though generally less systematically. British forces had access to benzedrine, an amphetamine compound, which saw limited distribution. American forces used benzedrine more widely, particularly among Air Force crews flying long missions. The Japanese military used methamphetamine extensively, calling it Hyropon, a combination that contributed to the fanatical resistance Allied forces encountered in the Pacific. Every major combatant nation recognized that chemical enhancement of human performance offered tactical advantages worth the medical consequences. Post-war, the pharmaceutical practices of World War II were quietly filed away, rather than openly discussed. No nation wanted to acknowledge that it had chemically enhanced soldiers' performance, both because of the ethical implications and because of the addiction problems that emerged among veterans. Methamphetamine and amphetamine addiction among World War II veterans was widespread, but rarely attributed to military use. The official narrative emphasized courage and endurance. The chemical reality remained classified or ignored. Modern military forces continue to use stimulants, though with better understanding of the risks and consequences. Modafinil has largely replaced amphetamines for situations requiring extended wakefulness. The drug provides alertness enhancement with fewer cardiovascular effects and lower addiction potential. But the fundamental calculation remains unchanged. In extreme circumstances, military necessity sometimes demands pharmaceutical override of normal human limitations. Senior Sergeant Pavlov survived the defense of his namesake building. He collapsed on November 26, 1942, after 58 consecutive days holding the position. Medical officers found him unconscious in the building's basement, along with 3 other defenders who'd similarly collapsed after the German assault finally broke off. He'd been awake, by his own estimation, for approximately 70 hours during the final German push. The Pervitin tablets had kept him conscious and functional. But when the immediate threat passed and he allowed himself to rest, his body simply shut down completely. He recovered physically after 2 weeks in a field hospital. The psychological and chemical dependency took longer. Post-war Soviet records, declassified in the 1990s, show that Pavlov sought treatment for nervousness and insomnia multiple times between 1945 and 1953. The treatment records don't explicitly mention methamphetamine dependency, but the symptoms match perfectly. A man whose brain chemistry had been altered by sustained combat stimulant use, trying to function in peacetime without the pharmaceutical enhancement that had become normal during the war. November 1942, Stalingrad. Pavlov stood in the ruins holding a position that should have fallen days earlier. The small white tablets in his pocket weren't courage and weren't ideology. They were methamphetamine, keeping his brain artificially alert while his body screamed for sleep. The defense of Stalingrad succeeded through many factors: tactics, logistics, weather, German mistakes. But one factor rarely discussed in official histories was pharmaceutical. The waiting Soviet defenders stayed conscious and fighting longer than should have been biologically possible because chemistry temporarily overrode biology. The tablets worked. The soldiers held. The cost was paid in cardiac complications, addiction, and decades of post-war suffering that never made it into the victory narrative.